we've done for the last few weeks, we are going to pick up another Old Testament story, several of them, hopefully. But our goal is to do two things. Number one, we are trying to create an understanding of how we read these stories. How do we pull truth out of these Old Testament narratives? And then number two, our second goal is to start to try to figure out how we apply the truth we find in these stories to our lives. So today we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so looking at a series of stories in the life of Abraham. And I think one of the things that I'm kind of excited about today is that I think we find in the life of Abraham some truth that really matters. And it might be for people living literally in America right now today, this might be one of the most important sections of story that we can study and pull truth out of. So we are going to dive in by kind of taking a little bit of an overview look, just get a snapshot of what Abraham's life was. So we find the story beginning in Genesis 12. And in Genesis 12, we find that Abraham has an encounter with God. And he and God have an interaction where God essentially just grabs him and says, hey, look, I want you to leave the land you've grown up in and move to a place that I'm going to tell you. And as you do that, I'm going to make you a blessing. You'll be a blessing to the people around you. And then we move on from there. Abraham does what he's asked. He gets up, he leaves. And then we find a series of stories. Now, one of the things that's interesting is the book of Genesis is 50 chapters, but Abraham's life takes up the largest section of this book. There's a couple reasons for that. The primary one being is the authors of these first 5 books in our Old Testament were concerned about demonstrating how God was going to create a way for all mankind to be saved. These are stories ultimately about salvation. And so this story about Abraham is, for all intents and purposes, it is the beginning. He's the first main character. He's the founding father of the nation of Israel. And in this main character, we are going to see God make a couple of different covenants. We're going to see God put a call on Abraham's life. And then we're going to watch Abraham live out this call and these covenants in a way that establishes the possibility for literally all humankind after him to not only interact with God, but ultimately to find salvation. So the writers of Genesis understood that this was ultimately the beginning not only for the nation of Israel, but for the story of salvation. And so they spent a bunch of time telling us the stories of Abraham. And one of the things I want us to look at, because I think it's interesting, is if we were to talk to a number of conservative Christian thinkers about Abraham, we would find that a lot of them tell us the same thing. And what we would discover is they would say that God makes essentially a unilateral covenant with Abraham. That God says to Abraham, I am going to do something for you. I'm going to make you something. And Abraham's response to that almost didn't matter, essentially. That God was going to use Abraham to work through him to create this story of salvation. And Abraham was almost like just along for the ride, essentially. And what's interesting about that is we have adopted some of that same philosophy in the way we talk about Christianity. And what I mean is, most of us believe, I do too, so when I say most of us, I'm including me, but most of us believe when we talk about salvation, that salvation is a gift from God. And we're told in the scriptures that that gift is not by works. I don't earn it. I don't deserve it. Jesus Christ died on a cross to allow the power of the Holy Spirit to step into my world and redeem me regardless of my action. And that's absolutely true. But what we find in Genesis is that in each of, not only just in Abraham's call, but in each of Abraham's covenants, God has an expectation for Abraham. There's something that Abraham has to do or enact in order to be a part of this covenant. And I think that reality has the ability to play into the way we think about and interact with our faith in ways that are really, really important. And that's where we're going. So let's kind of dive into Abraham and we'll get to that. So in Genesis chapter 11, at the end of Genesis chapter 11, we find the story of Abraham's father. And Abraham's dad was a guy named Terah, and Terah and his sons were on a journey, and they settled in the land of Haran. And in Genesis 12:1, this is where we pick up the story. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and his nephew Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. There is so much packed into these first 5 verses of Genesis chapter 12. And I want to hit on as much of it as I can, while still allowing us to keep the story moving forward from here. But one of the first things that I want to touch on is that God calls Abraham to make a move. But he is calling Abraham to make a move into darkness. Here's what I mean. Abraham has no idea where he's going. In fact, what God says to him is, "Leave your country and your people and your father's household and go to a place that I will eventually show you." So Abraham gets this call from God where God says, "Hey, you are surrounded by everything you know. The world that you've grown to understand and become accustomed to, people that you know, traditions that you know, your family, your friends, leave all of it and journey into something that you don't know." It's a journey into darkness for Abraham. It's a trip from light and understanding into darkness and essentially confusion, right? I'm going to take you somewhere and I'm not telling you where. Let's go. And so Abraham jumps in, right? He's like, okay, here we go. So God, starting in verse 2, then makes him a series of promises, right? He says, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." Now, we're going to stop here because verse 2 is fascinating when we pick apart the language. And obviously we've talked before, but I'm reading out of the New International Version, and the end of verse 2, the last few words say, "You will be a blessing." Now this phrase, "you will be a blessing," in some older translations of the text were translated, "you shall be a blessing." And for most of us, the word "shall" is kind of formal language we don't even really use every day anymore. But we also kind of think of it as interchangeable now with the word "will." The word "will" and the word "shall" are both future tense verbs, something that will happen in the future. And it's something in the context, it's sort of understood as this is going to happen, right? You will. Originally, in the English language, the word "shall" had a bit of a different connotation, and the connotation to it was more along the lines of, it was still future tense, but the future tense included an obligation. Okay, so we find that that's still true in legal language in the United States. Right? If I sign a legal contract, most of the time it describes my obligation using the word shall. That's really the only place we still make that distinction. But in this context, in the context of Genesis 2, the last few words of this phrase, I think it's an important distinction to make because of what's happening underneath our English text. So, in Genesis chapter 2, we find the phrase, you will be a blessing, or you shall be a blessing. But the word you will be is one word in Hebrew. And in the Hebrew language, that one word is in what's called the imperative form, which means it's a command. So the end of verse 2 could be translated, you must be a blessing. So while it's easy to just grab this chunk of text and sort of skim through it and move right past God's telling Abraham all these great things that Abraham's going to be, right? I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. But the next line is actually, but you must be a blessing. And that's really different from, and you will be a blessing. Now, as we move on from here and we start to study the story of Abraham, if, let's just say for the sake of argument, that I might be wrong, right? That maybe the Hebrew thing we just talked about is not true. Well, we can decide whether or not it's an accurate translation by watching the story of Abraham unfold. So as Abraham lives the next, 11, 12, 13 chapters in the book of Genesis, we can watch his choices and then decide whether or not we think Abraham thought he had a mandate to be a blessing to the people around him. And I want to do that just a little bit together today. So as we keep moving forward, God says to Abraham, you must be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So God makes Abraham this series of promises, and right in the middle of it, there's this phrase, which I've kind of played with our translation, and you must be a blessing. Okay, so Abraham leaves, does what he says. He takes his wife and his nephew, and they head out and move in. They start on this journey, the journey that we've described as a journey into darkness, into the unknown. And they get to this land. Abraham finds this spot in Canaan, and he builds an altar to God. And then he continues on his way. Okay, Abraham moves. Now, here's what's interesting is Abraham moves. He builds an altar to God, and then he moves forward into Egypt. Now, what's interesting about Egypt is we've had a conversation a couple of times over the last few weeks where we described the text. When the text sends someone down into Egypt, it is a journey into chaos. It's a move into darkness. As they move down, the nation of Israel typically finds themselves in slavery. Right? So Abraham is moving into the unknown. He's moving into darkness, and he finds himself on his way down into a place that's typically reserved in the text for the idea of slavery and trial and trouble. Okay, well, what do we find happens in Genesis chapter 12 as we keep moving forward is Abraham ends up in some trouble. Okay, so he gets into Egypt, then he has a moment where he thinks, gosh, my wife is really pretty, and these Egyptians, who knows if we can trust them. So let's just, hey, sweetheart, let's just tell a lie and say you're my sister, which is really, as we read in the story, just an exaggeration, but it's still not quite the truth. And so they do that, and Pharaoh takes Abraham's wife to be his wife, thinking that she's Abraham's sister. Now, that's a trial, right? That's chaos. This is bad. Okay, now God sorts it out. Not only does Abraham get his wife back before anything inappropriate happens between her and Pharaoh, but Abraham also finds himself pretty rich at the end of this deal because Pharaoh feels bad about what he did, and he's like, man, here's a bunch of money and animals. Get out of here. Right? So Abraham takes Sarah and all of his newly found wealth and riches, and they take off. Now, one of the first things that happens in this story that I just want to camp on for a minute is after this interesting situation happens in Egypt, Abraham and Lot move back up. They're heading back up, which should tell us inherently that things are going good in the story. They're moving up out of Egypt. Okay, so they're moving toward order. They're moving toward light. And something interesting happens because Lot, Abraham's nephew, at this point in the story, has also managed to make a bunch of money, and he's got a lot of cattle and servants, and Abraham has a bunch of cattle and servants. And so they're all sharing this same area. They kind of are wandering their cattle around, and there's all these animals and all these people. And Abraham's servants and his nephew Lot's servants start arguing. And as they start arguing, they're arguing about territory, essentially. That's my phone blowing up. More noise. They're arguing about territory, essentially. And so Abraham turns to Lot, and he does something really interesting. And we find in chapter 13 of Genesis that Abraham says to Lot, look, let's not quarrel. You're my nephew. We're family. We shouldn't be fighting like this. So I'll tell you what. You look to your left, and you look to your right, and evaluate the land. Decide what you like better, and then go there. And I'll take whatever's left. Let's split up, but you pick. Now, this is an interesting idea if we jump back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. And it's an interesting idea to me because God says to Abraham, I want you to leave and go to a land that I'm going to show you. But you have to be a blessing to the people around you. So now Abraham, he's got plenty of money, lots of cattle, but man, all of that cattle and all of that wealth, it's reliant on the land to sustain it. Right? If I pick bad land, if I wander all my cattle into a desert and they start dying off, I am rapidly decreasing my net worth, so to speak. So Abraham gets to this place where they've got all this stuff. Now he has something he has to take care of. He's responsible for. But he turns to his nephew Lot and says, pick. You go wherever you want. Essentially, I'll take whatever's left over. Now, if Abraham has been told that he must be a blessing, the way he interacts with his family is interesting. Right? Lot, you take the best. I'll take what's left. I think there's something to that. I think there's something to that about what it means to be a blessing for the people around us and the way we interact with our family. We'll get into that in a little bit. But so we're going to keep going in the story. So they split up. Lot, we find out that Lot moves toward an area that's fertile and lush and great, and Abraham kind of stays where he is. And Lot moves, the text tells us Lot moves towards Sodom. Now, this is obviously a little kind of hint at what is coming, right? Because most of us know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and God is going to show up and destroy this city in a pretty incredible way. And Lot is moving toward that place. That's interesting. So as Lot moves toward Sodom, we find out in the story that Lot ends up getting kidnapped by a group of kings. Okay, these kings, they come in, they take over Sodom, they kidnap a bunch of people and drag them out. And Lot gets thrown into this, clump of people who get taken by this group of kings. So Abraham reacts to that. Someone from one of Lot's servants or a neighbor shows up to Abraham and they say, Abraham, Lot just got kidnapped by this group of kings. Abraham says, oh really? I got this. So the text tells us in chapter 14 that Abraham grabs 318 soldiers. 318 soldiers, which, by the way, were members of his household. That's interesting. This guy, Genesis, has a little money, builds himself an army. Crazy. So Abraham and his army of 318 soldiers, they chase after these kings who have taken Lot captive. And when they catch up to these three kings, they have a physical altercation, right? And Abraham gets Lot back. Not only does Abraham get Lot back, but he gets all of the stuff that these kings had taken as well. So God says to Abraham, you must be a blessing, right? Abraham's nephew Lot is a grown man, perfectly capable of taking care of himself. Lot finds himself captured by these kings. Abraham's response to Lot's trouble isn't, gosh, you know what? Lot's a grown man. He can take care of himself. He chose to go over that way. I didn't pick. I let him pick. He went wherever he wanted. He got captured. That was a bad move on his part. I'm going to stay right here with my crew, and we're going to just, keep doing our thing. That was not how Abraham chose to respond. In fact, what Abraham did was he literally went to war to save his nephew. When we talk about the idea of, did God tell Abraham you will be a blessing, or did he tell Abraham you must be a blessing? Because if in the back of my mind when I'm making decisions based on a command from God to be a blessing to the people around me, there's no way I leave my nephew in slavery, trapped by four kings. Now, I'm not saying if without that command we just let whoever do whatever, right? That's not my point. But it's interesting to watch Abraham's choices to gather an army of people that he's not only trained but paid, and to take that army directly into conflict in order to rescue his nephew. It's interesting that it's possibly a reflection of how Abraham interpreted what God was requiring of him based on this covenant in Genesis chapter 12, the call in Genesis chapter 12. Now, as the story moves forward from there, we get to chapter 15, and in chapter 15, another interesting thing happens. And God makes another covenant with Abraham, okay? But this covenant is about land. So God grabs Abraham and he says, look, all around you, you're in the land of Canaan. Everything you see is going to be yours, okay? And then he says, look at the heavens. Do you see the stars? This is how numerous your offspring will be. So chapter 15 essentially outlines this covenant between God and Abraham about the exact land God is going to give to Abraham. And it outlines this covenant between God and Abraham about how numerous the generations after him are going to become. Now, again, this is interesting because when we talk about this covenant, typically in modern day terms, we find people using language that says Abraham had no obligation here. The obligation was 100% God's. So let's talk about that for a second. We find a really cool Old Testament thing happening at the end of chapter 15 in Genesis. So God says to Abraham, let's make this covenant, essentially. And so he has Abraham take a bunch of animals. Okay, starting in verse 10. Abraham brought animals to him, a heifer, a goat, a ram, and a dove, and a pigeon. Abraham brings these animals. He prepares the animals for sacrifice. Okay, so he slices them down the middle. You don't cut the birds in half. That's normal, so he just leaves the birds whole, but he's got these animals prepared for sacrificing these birds. Now, typically, when you're making this kind of a covenant in the Old Testament, you divide these animals up, and then in this sort of covenant exchange, each person would take fire, and if there were two of us making an agreement, two men, we would each take fire and we would walk between these sacrifices, essentially, and that was the symbol of the covenant we were making. Now, what's interesting is that at the end of Genesis 15, Abraham lays out these animals and then goes to sleep. In fact, you can infer from the text that God put Abraham to sleep. Okay? So God puts this sleep on Abraham, and then we find out that this blazing torch appears, and it passes between the pieces of the animals. And so the text says, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, your descendants will get this land. And then they map out the land. Well, God essentially acts as the only person who walks between these sacrifices. So he's making a covenant on his own, except there's this crazy verse in chapter 15. It's verse chapter 6. Or it's verse chapter 6. Sorry, it's verse 6. And what we find is, in the text, Abram believed God, believed the Lord, and the Lord credited to him as righteousness. Now, what's interesting to me is we have a tendency to read this passage and say, God makes this covenant with Abraham on his own. There's no obligation or responsibility on the part of Abraham. But before the covenant happens, before the actual agreement takes place where the sacrifices are made, we're told something very interesting about Abraham. We're told that Abraham has already believed God's promise. So there's this moment of faith that has happened on the part of Abraham before any of the rest of the agreement has taken place. And we're told that God took Abraham's moment of faith and said, Abraham, you are righteous because of this moment of faith. That's a really interesting idea we're also going to pick up later. Okay, so I realize we're going fast. It's a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, but lots of story. So we keep going. Okay, so we start off in Genesis chapter 12 with this calling. But the calling includes a command that Abraham must be a blessing. We get to chapter 15 with the first of two covenants that God makes with Abraham. And although it's possible to read this text as God makes this covenant with Abraham unilaterally, God's the only one that passes between these sacrifices, and so God is responsible to fulfill the covenant, which is true. Abraham has already done something in chapter 15 that is necessary for anything else that happens. And what's necessary is Abraham's belief in the promise of God. So, story continues. Now we get to chapter 17. And in Genesis chapter 17, we find one of the most intense pieces of covenant in the Old Testament, because God essentially says to Abraham, I am God. Walk before me and be blameless. I will confirm my covenant between me and you, and I will greatly increase your numbers. And so Abraham falls face down, and God says, starting in verse 4, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many. I will make you very fruitful, and I will make nations, and kings will come from you. I will establish an everlasting covenant with you and your descendants after you for generations to come. I will be your God, and I will be the God of your descendants. So there's this one of the most incredible promises we find anywhere in the Old Testament God makes right here with Abraham. And God says to him, this is my part of this covenant. I'm going to make you the father of nations. Kings will come from you. The world will be blessed by you. This is my half. Your half is to get circumcised. You and every member of your household have to be circumcised. Now, what's interesting about this to me, and for the way we're going to finish out our story here in a couple of minutes, is that God is making a covenant with Abraham that is forever. He essentially says, I'm creating an everlasting covenant with you. But Abraham, again, has an obligation here, right? And his obligation is actually, I'm going to argue it's actually two pieces. The first one is what we just read. It happens here in verse 11 of chapter 17. You have to be circumcised. Action is required. Okay? But I also think there's a second obligation. And the second obligation happens clear back at the beginning of chapter 17. chapter 17, verse 1, once again says, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. Now this is interesting, and it's interesting because it's not like God says, I am the Lord. I would like for you to try to do pretty good. That's not what happens here. God is giving Abraham another direct command. And the command is implied in the text. I am the Lord your God. You must walk before me and be blameless. And I will confirm my covenant between the two of us. So, we have Abraham. We see Abraham get a calling from God, a call to walk into the unknown. Okay, a call to move into darkness. But the call into darkness comes with the command. You must be a blessing you must be a blessing, is what we're told. Right? Then God makes these two covenants with Abraham. One of the covenants, for it to be fulfilled, Abraham had to believe. For the second covenant to be fulfilled, Abraham had to take action. Okay? Now, we're going to stop so we write those two things down. Okay? I'm going to make sure I'm on the right side on the board. Okay. There's a calling from God. Okay? Calling. And the calling included Abraham's obligation. And I'm using obligation even though it's a really intense, sorry, it might run out of space, obligation, yeah. Even though it's a really intense language, I'm using it on purpose because I think it's intense. Abraham has an obligation. He must be a blessing. Okay? And then there's these two covenants. And in the first one, the first covenant required Abraham's belief. And the belief covenant essentially was God promising Abraham the land. Okay? It's a land covenant. It's about a home and descendants. And that covenant required Abraham's belief. That was number one. The second covenant God makes with Abraham is this eternal covenant. It's an agreement of an everlasting relationship. Okay? So we're going to call it a relational covenant. It's a relational commitment, essentially. But that relational commitment, oops, did this backwards. It's a commitment of relationship, and that relational commitment required Abraham's action. Walk before me and be blameless. Interesting stuff. We'll find out why it's so interesting here in just a couple minutes, hopefully. If I don't run us right out of time before I make any points. Now, something else really interesting happens in chapter 18. So we get to Genesis 18 as we keep walking our way through Abraham's story. And 3 visitors show up to pay Abraham a visit, right? The text tells us that it's the Lord and 2 of his angels. This is a pretty interesting story. What a way to start, right? Abraham meets these 2 guys. Prepares a meal for them. They sit and talk, have a conversation. Then as they're leaving, Abraham gets up and he's kind of walking down the road with them. And the text tells us in chapter 18, verse 16, when the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. And then the Lord said, should I hide from Abraham? Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation. Nations on the earth have been blessed through him. So let's tell Abraham what's about to happen. So the Lord turns to Abraham and says, verse 20, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If it's not, if their actions are not that bad, I'm going to know. So the 2, text says the 2 men, essentially these 2 angelic beings that were with God, they start to go towards Sodom, and Abraham and the Lord stay together. And Abraham comes up to God in one of, gosh, I'm not kidding, one of the craziest exchanges in the Old Testament. Abraham says to God, God, are you going to destroy Sodom? God's like, yep, I sure am. And Abraham says, God, what if there are 50 righteous people in that city? Are you going to kill everyone for 50 righteous people? So God, according to the story, you get the impression that God is bargaining, right? He's changing his mind as they go, right? Well, if there's 50 people there, Abraham, I won't destroy it, okay? So Abraham very apologetically says, God, I'm so sorry, I'm going to do this again. But what if there's 45 people there? You're going to kill the whole city if there's 45 righteous people? And God's like, okay, all right, I'll give you that one too. Okay, now, so what if there's 40, God? Okay, if there's 40, I won't destroy it. And they keep going, right? God, what if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? God, if there's 10 righteous people in this city, are you going to kill everyone? Then God says to him, I'll tell you what, if I can find 10 righteous people, I'll let this city live. Okay? Now, this story is weird. It's weird to read. It doesn't really make any sense. Like, God comes to me and he says, you see all those bad people? I'm going to wipe them out. And the reality for most of us is we're going to go get them. Thank you, Lord. I've been waiting for you to take out those bad guys in Sodom. Take them down, right? And man, it's even possible, based on what we know about Abraham and the way he has grown in wealth and power over the last, chapters, years of his life. It's even possible for Abraham to sit back and be like, take that city out, because that's more land for me. Once you wipe them out, man, I'll just let my cattle graze over there too, right? And man, but that's not what he does. What he does is, gosh, God, you know what? I think, Lord, I should speak on behalf of the righteous. But what's interesting about that is Abraham doesn't speak on behalf of the righteous. He speaks on behalf of the righteous to save everyone. And that's an interesting idea too, right? Why on earth would this guy find it necessary to argue with God, to essentially bargain for the lives of a bunch of people who are so wicked God has showed up to destroy them in the first place? Why would he do this? Well, man, we could pretty reasonably argue that Abraham is enacting what he believes was God's command to be a blessing. Okay? Abraham, what are you doing? This doesn't make any sense. Well, do you know what? It makes perfect sense. If God told me I had a requirement to be a blessing to the people around me, I had an obligation to look out for everyone around me and take care of them to the best of my ability. If this is my obligation and God shows up and says I'm wiping out this city, I have to do something. I'm required to do something. My faith won't let me do anything else. And so we watch, so far in the story, we could very easily make the conjecture that we have watched Abraham, number one, step into a family catastrophe and rescue his nephew because he believes that's what God would have had him do. And then we've watched Abraham literally come between God and sinners and act as a mediator. He's arguing for righteous people, but his argument to mediate between God and the righteous includes everyone in the picture. And that's a really interesting idea. And so we've seen Abraham start to flesh out what he believes it means to be a blessing by standing in the gap, by literally defending and protecting the people around him, defending and protecting the people who have, in some sense, been entrusted to his care, his nephew who he essentially raised. Okay? And then we watch Abraham be a blessing by standing in the gap on behalf of not only righteous people, but sinners, to protect them from the wrath of God. That's interesting. And I am out of time, which is a bummer, right? Because I have a bunch more stuff to say about Abraham. But this is where I want us to start thinking as we, kind of take a break between now and next week. And what I want us to start thinking about is a couple of things. First of all, our premise is that these stories are not about me. They're about Jesus. That these stories teach me something about God. And Jesus said in Luke chapter 24, everything you find in the Old Testament is about me. And if that's the case, Abraham making sacrifices for the people around him because he believes that's what it means to be a blessing isn't unusual. It's a model of what we're going to watch Jesus do. And Abraham stepping into the gap to act as a mediator between God and not only righteous people, but act as a mediator between God and the sinners around the righteous people. This is also a picture of exactly what we're going to get to watch Jesus do as we jump forward into his story. And I think what we're going to discover as we move forward together, obviously next week, is that this text and what we find in the stories of Jesus is that you and I also have the same obligation. Our calling into belief in Christ was more than just a free gift of eternity. It's a covenant of eternity, relational covenant. But gosh, if we can just grab one little piece of this story of Abraham, it's possible that our relational covenant with God requires some action on our part. And that's where we'll dive into next week. So thanks for hanging with me today. We will pick back up with the second half of the story of Abraham next Wednesday.